Welcome to The Maintenance Mindset, an audio-video podcast brought to you by the Multifamily Media Network. I'm your host, Paul Rhodes, and over the more than 3 decades in the apartment industry, I've had roles that include being on-site, providing services as a vendor, creating and delivering multiple education programs, and active association work. This podcast is centered on the often overlooked role that our on-site maintenance workers play. You know, the men and women that respond in the middle of the night to the toilet call, or the after hours, it's really hot in my apartment request, or my favorite, my ring fell down the drain, get over here now. In other words, the often unsung heroes who are responsible for asset preservation and resident satisfaction. Working in multifamily maintenance provides interesting, sometimes amusing, and often fascinating stories and viewpoints. My encouragement to you is this: whatever you do it with a maintenance mindset. Hey there. It occurred to me that it's been a while since we've talked about actual maintenance skills. So, based on a phone call recently from a friend, I thought we'd talk about water heaters. Now, shout out to Crystal, who gave me a call recently because her maintenance supervisor was on vacation, and she, as the property manager, got a call from a resident that didn't have hot water, and Crystal responded. She went to go look at it and suddenly realized that she didn't know about water heaters and gave me a call. I'm honored that she thought enough of me to ask. So after we got finished and diagnosed the problem, she suggested that it might be a good idea to talk about them. So here we are. Crystal, thanks again for the phone call. And, you know, we begin our water heater discussion by talking of the fact that we are, in fact, discussing just a water heater, not a hot water heater. You know, it's kind of along the same lines of your dishwasher. Why would you wash your dishes before you put them into a dishwasher when proper operation of the dishwasher will wash the dishes for you? Why are we doing it twice? Water heater's the same way. Why, if the water's already hot, why do we need to heat it? So that linguistic challenge aside, a water heater is essentially a tank, or tankless if you're dealing with the newer units, that it takes water from one temperature and elevates it up to a higher temperature that I know each and every one of us prefers to have. So when we bathe, it's much more comfortable than it used to be in olden times. That hot water, though, has limits. By limits, there is codes that tell us the maximum amount of temperature that the water is allowed to be. The code begins for residential water heaters with the maximum water temperature at the closest faucet to the water heater is 128 degrees. Now, that's the closest faucet. Since I brought up the dishwasher, we'll talk about it again. Remember that the dishwasher only uses 4 to 6 gallons maximum. And there are pipes in between the dishwasher and the water heater. And it takes some time for that hot water to get to the appliance. Well, the closest faucet, if its temperature is over 128 degrees, you need to turn down the water heater. Over time, the temperature of the water in your water heater is going to decrease. So it's something for us to pay attention to. And the way you would do that is you take your thermometer, put it in the flow of water, and let it go up until it reaches its maximum point. And as long as that maximum is below 128, you're safe within code. The reason why it's 128 is when you get to 129, scalding can happen much, much faster for especially our at-risk residents, specifically elderly and kids. My properties and many of the properties I've worked on, they limit the temperature coming out of that faucet at 120 degrees. That way, if there ever is a situation where the water heater actually goes over for whatever reason, we're still under that safety threshold. I really do like that idea. Now, water heaters themselves are a simple device. It's a tank with something to elevate the temperature of the water. Either an electric water heater contains 1 or 2 burners, or a gas water heater contains 1 burner at the bottom. Depending on the cost and the capacity of your water heater, it could have some various circulation devices or things that help to maintain an even temperature top to bottom in the water heater. But in the end, all it is a tank that both heats and stores the water. That way, it's ready for use. Around that tank is insulation. Now, very recently, from a regulatory standpoint, the National Apartment Association has reported that there was legislation that has been stricken down. That legislation was for tankless water heaters. Now, that's not to say that there's not going to be regulation. Wow, how many double negatives can I put in one sentence? It is possible that there will be some regulations in water heaters. Again, I mean, that's not unheard of. We had regulation that came through that affected our properties back in the early 2000s. And the last one that really gave us an effect was in 2014. And it's surrounding water efficiency of a water heater. And the reason why that is critical to understand is that water as a substance is very good at absorbing heat energy. In other words, it requires a lot of energy to heat the water. And in 2014, the most recent legislation, there was a large change in the efficiency requirements of water heaters. The challenge is 1 BTU can raise 1 pound of water by 1 degree. That's what a BTU is. And it doesn't matter how efficient you make the device that applies the 1 BTU, you still are required to have 1 BTU to heat up 1 pound of water. That's the measurement. The only way we can make water heaters tanks more efficient is to decrease the heat loss. And this is what led to the challenges specific to the apartment industry back in 2014, 2015. As a matter of fact, you are probably very familiar with this if your community has water heaters on it, that when it was built, the construction date occurred before roughly 2012, 2013. And the reason why I'm saying that specific date is chances are the space that was designed in construction for your water heater to occupy was smaller than the size of our new water heaters today. Back at that time, water heaters went to an additional roughly 2.5 inches in circumference, meaning around. So they got bigger sideways, but they also added 1 inch to 3 inches in height. That is not good when you happen to be working at a property where the water heater is installed in either underneath your air handler to where you're working, you've got like 2 or 3 inches there, or like a couple of the properties I did training for at the time where it's installed above the dryer. So you have this 40 or 50 gallon water tank above your head, and you have the dryer that goes underneath. In both of those instances, there is not a lot of room to work with the same capacity tank that grows in its footprint. To remedy this, manufacturers were actually decreasing capacity of the tank, so that instead of, for your 40-gallon tank being roughly, roughly 3 feet 3 inches in diameter, they decreased the tank from 40 gallons down to 38 gallons. And by doing that, they could make the tank back to be the same physical dimensions. The challenge there is they lost capacity. I know of properties that actually went even further than that. They took out a 50-gallon tank and they put back a 40-gallon tank. Those are all potential remedies that have to be done to meet the physical demands of the space that we have to repair. Our residents, we have to provide them with hot water. It's a part of the service that our residents expect. Which, by the way, that does bring up an interesting question. If you have a resident that does not have hot water from an individual tank for their apartment, is that an emergency that your maintenance team is responding to overnight? I've spoken with management companies that are on either side of the fence. No, some of them say, no, it's not an emergency, and maintenance just responds first thing in the morning during a normal day. Other cases, it is an emergency, and maintenance goes out in the middle of the night to diagnose and get them hot water in the morning. I am aware of a couple of states that the regulation, they include hot water as a part of sanitation. And in those cases, it is an emergency. But it's an important thing to think through. I could actually make an argument either way. In the end, I know that if hot water goes out in my house, it is an emergency. So I am responding. Inside that water heater tank, there are relatively few parts. In the case of an electric water heater, you have 1 or 2 burners. In the case of a gas water heater inside the tank, you have a chimney that goes up. That chimney could either be straight or it could curve around, depending upon the style of the device. Now, other than that difference from electric to gas, everything else is the same. Every water heater, gas or electric, will contain an anode rod and a dip tube. These two components serve important purposes. The dip tube carries cold water from the inlet at the top of the water heater down to the bottom of the water heater. The anode rod is a metal rod that has an electrical purpose. We'll talk more about the anode rod in a moment because it is affected by the efficiency of the dip tube. You see, water as a substance stratifies, meaning that when it changes temperature, its chemistry does some interesting things. And I'm not a scientist, but I was awake a couple of times in high school in chemistry class to remember some things. And those things actually have application both for our water heater and our swimming pool chemistry. One of the biggest things is the fact that calcium is a mineral that is found in all water, some areas of our country more than others. Recently, I was out in Phoenix, Arizona, and I swear I took a drink of water from the faucet, and before I was able to drink it, I had to chew it. There was that much calcium in it. We frequently refer to water that has a high calcium content as being hard water. Now, the reason why this is important for us is that calcium is the mineral, the element that water has a demand for. In other words, based on the water itself, that H2O, there will be a specific quantity of calcium that the water wants. If the water wants more calcium, it will steal calcium from wherever it can get it from. This means it can take it from pipes, from plumbing, from, in the case of our swimming pool, it'll take it from the plaster, from the tile, from the components. Anything that touches water, if it's got calcium and the water needs the calcium, it will steal it. The reverse or the opposite is true, to where if the water has too much calcium, then it will deposit that calcium. The challenging part, and why this is relevant for our water heaters, is that the differing agent for calcium demand is temperature. You see, calcium is a weird element. I live in the South, and in the South, there is one beverage which is very, very important for us to have, and that is iced tea. Now, if you're from the South, you know that there is only one way that iced tea is to be consumed, and that is sweet. Now, depending on where you're at in the South, the apparent level of sweetness can vary. But one thing I've noticed is whenever I leave the South and I go sit down in a restaurant, and if I order iced tea, that tea comes only one way: unsweetened. And if you're from the South and you want sweet tea, but you go somewhere outside of the South and you ask for sweet tea, they look at you like you got a horn growing out of the middle of your head, because they just don't do sweet tea. And when you ask for sweet tea, they point you to the little container on the table that has sugar on it. Now, if you've ever tried to put sugar into iced tea, what happens? That's right, you get crunchy tea because the sugar doesn't dissolve. Why doesn't the sugar dissolve in a cold liquid? The answer is that in that temperature, the sucrose, or the sugar, the table sugar, has a hard time integrating itself with the liquid. What do you do in order to solve this? In other words, how do you get sugar into the liquid? Well, you heat up the tea. When you're brewing the tea, that's when you apply the, down here in the South, copious amounts of sugar that make it sweet tea. And that's because sugar melts or dissolves into the water better when the water is an elevated temperature. Well, that's sugar. I mean, I'm sure you've seen before where you have hot water or hot tea and you pour sugar into it. Quite frequently, the sugar dissolves before it even hits the bottom. Well, calcium is the opposite. You see, the hotter the water's temperature, the lower the demand for calcium. This means that if you were to take that same glass of iced tea, and for whatever reason, don't try this at home, kids, for whatever reason, you wanted to put calcium into the tea, it would dissolve before it hit the bottom, because the colder the water, the higher the demand for calcium. Now, this is important for our water heater discussion, because the water that enters our water heater is a lower temperature. That means that it is carrying a larger demand and a larger quantity of calcium. How this ends up playing out is the fact that when that water hits the bottom of the tank as cold, it begins to raise its temperature. And raising its temperature, it ends up doing some really interesting things. One of the interesting things that it does is by elevating its temperature, it loses calcium. Meaning, for those of you who are looking at video, this is the drain valve for a water heater. And when I pour it over, I have bits and pieces of calcium that come out into my hand. That is not dirt. It's not junk that was in the water that we need to apply a filter for. No, what I'm holding in my hand is calcium. It's called scale. And this is what happens from the water where the demand of calcium has changed. You see, inside our water heater, we have the dip tube that carries the cold water from the top of the tank to the bottom of the tank. The reason why we have that happening is because the water leaves the tank at the top. And by depositing the cold water at the bottom, we're following up on a second law of physics, or a second science fact, that colder water is more dense than hotter water. It's similar to air. I mean, air, when you heat up air, it gets lighter, which when you put that into a hot air balloon, apply heat to it, it gets so light that it will carry a basket and carry people and carry things in it. Well, water is the same way, meaning that colder water actually weighs more. It's more dense. The molecules pack tighter together, and for the same quantity of space, you will have more molecules of water. This is why temperature is constantly going up inside of a water heater. Because at the same time that we have water entering the top of our tank, going down the dip tube to the bottom of the tank, where it begins to heat up through either a gas burner or an electric burner, the temperature is rising. So it's depositing or dropping off calcium because the demand for calcium is decreasing. So some of that calcium comes out of solution. The second thing that happens is the water begins to expand. This causes the temperature to go up, or the pressure, to go up inside our tank. This is why we have a temperature and pressure safety valve attached to the tank. We'll talk more about that later. Because the water is increasing in temperature and it's losing the demand for calcium, that calcium comes out of solution and it gets deposited where the coldest part is. And that means that the bottom of your water heater tank will end up beginning to build up calcium. Over time on a gas water heater, this can cause your water heater to become less efficient, meaning it in effect insulates the water inside the tank from your burner. And that means that it takes longer for the water inside your tank to heat up and requires more energy. To prevent this, one of the things that we can do is actually take the valve on the side of a water heater tank, attach it to a garden hose, and flush our water heater. Now, the proper methodology to flush the water heater, there are a couple of different ways that people do it. My preferred methodology is to attach a garden hose, and the other end of that garden hose you put downhill. The reason why is what we're going to do is set up a siphon. In that, you turn off the gas or the electricity, open up the valve on the water heater drain valve with the tank still running. In other words, the inlet valve is turned on. Once you have the exit valve, the drain valve, open and water is flowing through the garden hose, then you turn off the supply valve and go to your bathtub. When you go to your bathtub, open up the valve or turn your single handle lever all the way over just to the hot side, and your water heater will begin to drain. Be very careful though. It is possible that depending on what kind of water heater valve you have, depending on what kind of bathtub valve or shower valve you have, it can have what is called a balancing spool in it. And what that does is it lets a little bit of hot water go, a little bit of cold water go through from the cold water side to the hot water side. So that can mean that while you're draining your water heater, you're actually putting a little bit of cold water from the cold water side of the valve in. If your community has those balancing spools, just turn off the cold water that feeds your apartment, or depending on what the way your plumbing works, turn off all the water to your shower, meaning the cold water side. What this will end up doing is, because you've got a garden hose attached to that drain valve and the water heater tank is draining, as long as that hose goes downhill, gravity will siphon the water out of your tank fairly quick. In siphoning the water out of your tank, you will remove all of that scale. Manufacturers state this should be done a minimum of annually. A.O. Smith, several years ago, when I got the opportunity to tour their factory, their recommendation is to do it every 6 months. Now, I recognize we have a challenge where preventive maintenance is concerned. My recommendation, if I ruled the world, every one of our apartments, when we turn it, in other words, when we're performing the make-ready maintenance, we would drain the water heater, flush the water heater at the same time. Once all the water is drained out, here's where the flushing occurs. Go back to the bathtub faucet and close it. Then open up the fill valve. In other words, you now have an empty tank that the drain is open. By opening the fill valve, what you're going to do is directly inject cold water into this empty tank. And because the tank is empty, that cold water that comes in will hit the bottom of the tank differently than it hit the bottom of the tank when the tank was full. What that will do is stir up all of the calcium, all of that debris that we looked at here a little bit ago. It'll stir it up. And because you're pressurizing the tank, it will force all of that debris out of the end of the garden hose. This gives us the opportunity to flush it out until you get all the calcium out. You can go to the opposite end of the garden hose, watch it, and once the water's clear, then you simply go back to the bathtub, open up the bathtub, close the drain valve, and begin filling up your tank. The reason why I recommend using the bathtub is we're staying away from all the aerators. By the way, for those of you on camera who get the opportunity to see this stuff right here, if you have old water heaters, this is the exact same stuff, debris, that you will find in the screens for your washing machine and your dishwasher. This calcium will clog that side of your of those appliances and cause problems. So we have a tank where we put cold water in and we heat that water up to give to our residents. But because we're dealing with a substance that has a calcium demand, When the temperature changes of that substance, it will drop off calcium where the temperature change occurs. That means inside of every one of our water heaters, we have scale building, that white crumbly calcium. We should, based on manufacturer standards, be flushing our water heaters a minimum of once a year. If we don't do it, okay, nothing catastrophic is going to happen now. However, over time, it will build up and it will cost our residents more money. It also can lead to temperature imbalances in the tank because that calcium will actually begin to form pockets, and you'll have water in that pocket in between the calcium and the metal. And what that means is when the burner turns on, specifically in a gas furnace, a gas water heater, when the burner turns on, water inside that pocket, because it's insulated that the calcium is making, that water will expand and you'll hear a knocking sound. This can also happen in an electric water heater, but it's less likely for it to occur there. Flush your water heaters. It will make them last longer. They will end up being quieter, and our residents will save money. We're going to stop here for this episode of the Maintenance Mindset, and we'll pick this up where we'll continue talking about water heaters and the service that they can require. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week, and I'll see you somewhere. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Maintenance Mindset. I hope you take away ideas that apply to your current and future career goals. Please check out Maintenance Mindset Minute to hear short-form, high-impact, applicable, maintenance-centered information. Whatever you do today, do it with a maintenance mindset. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, comment, and subscribe. Visit multifamilymedianetwork.com to learn more about our other industry podcasts, thought pieces, and sponsorship opportunities. I'll see you somewhere.